January 30th, 1944, Anzio beachhead, Italy. Headman Vera Hoffman gripped his pencil with a tense hand, leaning against the reinforced concrete of his command bunker, recording observations through the periscope. What he saw would soon redefine the understanding of modern siege warfare. A single artillery round had obliterated Bunker Louisa, reducing 4 feet of heavily reinforced concrete to rubble in an instant. Through the haze of dust and smoke, the outline of the crater remained, a stark testament to the sheer destructive power unleashed against what had been an 8-month stronghold. According to Wehrmacht engineering specifications, this bunker had been designed to endure direct hits from 210mm shells, yet it had vanished under a single strike from an American super-heavy artillery piece. 32 soldiers of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division disappeared along with tons of steel and concrete. The weapon responsible for this unprecedented feat was the M1 240mm Howitzer, making its combat debut with the 697th Field Artillery Battalion. Over the coming months, German defenders like Hoffman would come to recognize that conventional assumptions about fortifications no longer applied. The U.S. Army had deployed a weapon capable of turning even the most formidable bunkers into precise mathematical graves. The M1 had its origins in a 1940 U.S. Army Ordnance study, which concluded that existing artillery lacked the capability to neutralize contemporary European fortifications reliably. At the time, the heaviest gun in the American arsenal, the 155mm Long Tom, could inflict damage but could not consistently breach the reinforced concrete structures that had become standard in German defensive strategy. The new weapon specifications were ambitious. It had to be mobile, capable of firing a 360-pound shell over 14 miles with pinpoint accuracy, able to penetrate 6 feet of reinforced concrete, yet remain transportable by conventional military vehicles. Unlike the enormous railway guns of World War I, the resulting design from Waterfleet Arsenal in New York represented an extraordinary feat of engineering. In its firing position, the M1 weighed 64,700 pounds. Its 35-foot barrel alone accounted for 23,000 pounds and required specialized 6-wheeled transport. The gun demanded a 14-man crew to operate efficiently, achieving a maximum rate of 1 round every 3 minutes. Deployment was labor-intensive. Each gun required about 8 hours for setup, including excavation of a recoil pit and assembly with the ME2 crane specifically designed for the system. Production began in November 1942 with 6 prototype units. By 1944, Waterfleet Arsenal had reached a monthly output of 13 guns, ultimately completing 315 units before production ended in August 1945. The cost per unit, $380,000, equaled the value of approximately 12 Sherman tanks, yet the tactical and psychological effects of these weapons were immeasurable. The first M1 240mm Howitzers arrived at the Anzio beachhead in January 1944, delivered by the 697th and 698th Field Artillery Battalions. The German 14th Panzer Corps had fortified the surrounding hills with a network of interconnected bunkers, dominating all approaches to Allied positions. On January 30th, at 14:30 hours, the 697th fired its initial round in combat, targeting a German observation post on the Alburn Hills. The shell traveled over 23,000 yards, more than 13 miles, and struck directly. The bunker, its observation equipment, and its crew were annihilated in a single impact. Major Herman E. Smith, commander of the 697th, later documented the profound psychological consequences of the weapon. German prisoners reported widespread demoralization, describing the shells as earthquake rounds that shook the terrain for hundreds of meters around. Many soldiers refused to occupy fortified positions after witnessing the effects of the artillery. The operational record at Anzio highlighted the precision and efficiency of the super-heavy artillery. Across the campaign, 2,847 rounds were fired at 67 bunkers, with 61 destroyed, averaging just under 5 rounds per target. The maximum range achieved reached 25,100 yards. The German 715th Infantry Division, in its post-liberation war diary, remarked that American super-heavy artillery rendered previously secure fortifications untenable, marking a dramatic shift in the calculus of defensive warfare in Europe. During World War II, the deployment of 240mm Howitzers dramatically altered the dynamics of Allied offensives, producing results that far outstripped the outcomes of traditional artillery barrages. A striking demonstration occurred during the breakthrough at Monte Cassino in May 1944, highlighting the Howitzer's capacity to dismantle even the most formidable defensive positions. The German defensive line at Monte Cassino, known as the Gustav Line, had withstood repeated Allied attacks for several months. Anchored around the historic monastery, which German paratroopers had fortified into a near-impenetrable stronghold, the line posed a significant obstacle. On May 11, 1944, the 240th Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 8 M1 240mm Howitzers, joined Operation Diadem. Positioned near the village of Mano, these guns could reach every critical German emplacement along the Gustav Line. Their main objective was the heavily reinforced bunkers embedded into the mountainsides beneath the monastery. British Major General Francis Tucker, who commanded the 4th Indian Division and had witnessed the heavy losses in previous assaults, observed the impact of the American super-heavy artillery firsthand. The bombardment achieved what months of conventional artillery and air raids could not. Each shell obliterated its target, leaving no safe refuge for the defenders. The psychological effect was profound, as German troops quickly realized that all positions were vulnerable. Over the course of the breakthrough, the 240mm Howitzers fired continuously for 72 hours, expending 1,847 rounds. After-action assessments revealed that 39 of the 43 major bunkers hit were completely destroyed, while the remaining 4 were abandoned by their crews following near misses. The 240mm Howitzers' capabilities were also decisive in Operation Cobra, the July 1944 breakout from Normandy. The German 352nd Infantry Division had heavily fortified the area around Saint-Lô, creating a complex network of defenses that had stalled the Allied advance. On July 24, the 272nd Field Artillery Battalion brought its 240mm guns into action, systematically neutralizing the surviving strongpoints that had withstood massive aerial bombardments. Hill 122, a critical vantage point, featured concrete bunkers built into reverse slopes, rendering them almost impervious to air attacks. Technical Sergeant Raymond Jones of Battery A, 272nd Field Artillery, later recalled that after observers provided coordinates, 3 rounds could reduce a bunker to rubble almost instantly. The psychological shock prompted elite German troops, including the 3rd Parachute Division, to abandon their positions rather than face the destructive artillery. General Richard Schmey, their commander, was captured on July 31st and admitted that the presence of the super-heavy guns made static defense futile, noting that even seasoned soldiers fled their bunkers. The 240mm Howitzers' capabilities were further proven during the assault on the Gothic Line in northern Italy later that year. German engineers had spent over a year building fortifications along the Apennine ridges, leveraging the mountainous terrain to create positions believed immune to conventional artillery. Yet the combination of immense firepower, precise targeting, and coordinated fire control enabled Allied forces to systematically breach these positions, demonstrating the transformative impact of super-heavy artillery in mountainous combat. In September 1944, the 697th Field Artillery Battalion, veterans who had already seen combat at Anzio and participated in the push toward Rome, set up their heavy howitzers in the valleys beneath the Gothic line. From these positions, they were able to deliver high-angle artillery fire, effectively dropping shells almost vertically onto German defenses that were entrenched on the far slopes of mountainous terrain. The Fuda Pass, a strategic point controlling the main route to Bologna, became a clear demonstration of the battalion's destructive potential. German forces had fortified the pass with a complex network of bunkers constructed by Organization Taunt. On September 16, the 697th commenced a deliberate and methodical artillery assault on these defenses. Private First Class Donald Matthews, serving as ammunition handler, described the bombardment in letters home. The shells would ascend until they vanished into the clouds before descending almost straight onto the enemy positions, producing blasts that reverberated through the mountains. When a bunker was struck, it was reduced entirely to rubble. Within 5 days, the Fuda Pass was captured. Interestingly, German losses from collapsing bunkers surpassed those from direct combat, a fact noted in the War Diary of the 4th Parachute Division, which recorded that American super heavy shells are breaching overhead cover previously considered sufficient, leading to plummeting morale as troops abandoned fortifications. The sustained demolition of the Siegfried Line, beginning that September, represented one of the most significant contributions of the 240mm Howitzer to Allied success. Stretching 390 miles from the Netherlands to Switzerland, the West Wall contained over 18,000 defensive structures, including bunkers, pillboxes, and other fortified positions constructed between 1936 and 1940. The 265th Field Artillery Battalion arrived at the Siegfried defenses near Aachen in September 1944, equipped with M1 howitzers. The fortifications they faced were formidable. Type 10 bunkers with walls up to 4 feet thick, command bunkers reinforced with walls 8 feet thick, and infantry positions designed with overlapping fields of fire. Their first significant test occurred at the Schönhorst Line, an extension of the Siegfried defenses protecting Aachen. On October 8th, the battalion began preparatory bombardments in support of the 1st Infantry Division. Over a 6-hour period, 238 rounds were fired, demolishing 19 of the 22 targeted bunkers. Corporal Robert Williams, a forward observer with the 16th Infantry Regiment, recounted the effects of the bombardment. Each impact of a 240mm shell produced tremors comparable to minor earthquakes. Concrete structures once thought to require days to neutralize were obliterated within minutes, leaving German defenders virtually no opportunity to resist. This pattern of artillery efficacy continued along multiple fronts. The 278th Field Artillery Battalion, assigned to support operations in the Vorsek sector, destroyed 73 bunkers in the Schnee-Eifel region during December 1944. Likewise, the 698th Field Artillery Battalion, operating near Metz, systematically dismantled the fortress ring surrounding the city in November 1944, firing over 3,000 rounds across 2 weeks. The campaign through the Vosges Mountains from October to November 1944 presented unique obstacles. German troops had fortified heavily forested ridges, camouflaging bunkers among dense trees. This made aerial reconnaissance ineffective and limited conventional artillery impact. In response, the 265th Field Artillery Battalion developed specialized forest combat tactics. When proximity-fused shells were available, airbursts above the canopy could transmit destructive force down onto concealed bunkers. For conventional shells, the battalion applied a pattern of 4 rounds at the suspected perimeter corners, followed by 1 strike at the center. Master Sergeant Harold Anderson, Section Chief of the 265th, explained that precise targeting was often unnecessary. The immense power of the 240mm shell ensured that even near misses caused enough ground shock to collapse fortifications. After the artillery fire, infantry units would encounter nothing but craters and wreckage. The liberation of Strasbourg on November 23, 1944, was preceded by an intense bombardment targeting the city's outer fortifications. The German 553rd Infantry Division, having lost 12 bunkers within just 90 minutes of concentrated artillery strikes, abandoned their positions. Overall, the deployment of 240mm Howitzers throughout the late 1944 European campaigns showcased their strategic importance. From mountain passes to heavily defended urban lines, these weapons allowed Allied forces to neutralize previously impregnable German fortifications, often before infantry even engaged directly. Why the U.S. Army's 240mm Howitzer became a fortress killer. In the years following World War II, U.S. Army engineering teams conducted extensive technical reviews of battlefield performance. Among their most striking conclusions was an explanation for the devastating effectiveness of the M117 howitzer against hardened fortifications, an effectiveness that reshaped late-war ground operations in Europe. At the heart of this destructive power was a specially designed armor-piercing projectile known as the M17 concrete-penetrating shell. Rather than relying solely on explosive force, the M17 emphasized mass, velocity, and structural integrity. Its hardened steel nose cap allowed it to remain intact upon impact, while its enormous weight, over 360 pounds, carried it forward at nearly 2,300 feet per second. When this mass struck a target, it concentrated an estimated 2.8 million foot-pounds of kinetic energy into an impact surface measuring less than 20 square inches. The pressure generated exceeded 200,000 pounds per square inch, a level far beyond the compressive limits of even the most heavily reinforced wartime concrete. More important than raw force, however, was timing. A delayed action fuse allowed the shell to penetrate between 3 and 6 feet into a concrete structure before detonating. Instead of blasting outward, the explosion occurred inside the material itself. Engineers later described the resulting damage as sympathetic fracturing, a phenomenon in which shock waves rebounded through steel reinforcement bars, intersecting and amplifying stress within the structure until entire bunker systems collapsed internally. Alongside the M17, the 240mm arsenal also included a high-explosive round designated M114. This shell carried 49 pounds of TNT, enhanced with aluminum powder to intensify blast output. The result was an explosive effect roughly 40% greater than standard TNT alone. When fused for surface detonation, the M114 carved massive craters, up to 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep in soft soil, and only slightly smaller in rocky terrain. The price of super heavyweight firepower. Deploying weapons of this scale came at a significant logistical cost. A single 240mm artillery battalion consumed between 50 and 100 shells per day, translating to 18 to 36 tons of ammunition daily. Prime movers, generators, and support vehicles burned thousands of gallons of fuel. Specialized repair tools were required, and ammunition carriers had to be reinforced to withstand the immense weight of each round. The supply chain supporting this effort stretched across continents. From Watervliet Arsenal in New York to frontline artillery positions in Western Europe, shells sometimes traveled nearly 3,000 miles before being fired. Each round represented a triumph of industrial precision. Forged steel bodies, machining tolerances within 1/100th of an inch, carefully measured explosive fillings, finely calibrated fuses, and individual inspections followed by proof testing. By early 1945, American depots in Europe held more than 500,000 240mm shells. During peak operations, particularly the Rhine River crossings, monthly expenditure reached approximately 35,000 rounds. This scale of production and consumption reflected an industrial capacity that no Axis power, and not even the Soviet Union, could rival at the time. March 1945, the Rhine crossings. The ultimate demonstration of the 240mm Howitzers' battlefield role came during the Rhine River crossings in March 1945, where the weapon reached the height of its operational influence. During Operation Plunder, Field Marshal Montgomery's meticulously planned assault across the Rhine on March 23 to 24, Allied forces unleashed the largest artillery bombardment of the Western Front. The U.S. 12th Corps contributed 12 240mm howitzers, tasked with dismantling the fortified zone around Wessel, where the German 84th Infantry Division had constructed extensive bunker networks along the eastern bank. At precisely 1700 hours on March 23, the Super Heavy guns opened fire. Using detailed aerial reconnaissance photographs, American batteries engaged bunker after bunker in a methodical sequence. Captain William Morrison of Battery B, 278th Field Artillery Battalion, later recalled how his crews worked steadily from north to south, firing 4 to 6 rounds at each position. By midnight, 31 bunkers had been completely destroyed, with another dozen rendered unusable. German survivors described a collapse in morale as reinforced concrete positions, once believed indestructible, simply ceased to exist. Casualty reports from the 84th Division later recorded 2,400 losses attributed to artillery fire alone, most caused by structural collapses rather than direct blast injuries. Crushing the Ruhr Pocket. In early April 1945, the encirclement of Army Group B within the Ruhr Pocket marked another decisive phase. From April 1st to April 18th, American forces employed 240mm howitzers, targeting factories converted into fortified strongpoints. These were not field bunkers, but massive industrial complexes built from reinforced concrete and steel. The 698th Field Artillery Battalion supported operations in the northern sector, targeting facilities such as the Krupp Steelworks in Essen. On April 9th, the guns opened fire on factory buildings further strengthened with additional concrete layers. Walls over 3 feet thick offered no meaningful resistance. Staff Sergeant James Peterson, serving as a forward observer with the 313th Infantry Regiment, later described the scene. These structures were industrial fortresses, yet the shells tore through them with astonishing ease. The psychological impact proved overwhelming. Entire defending units surrendered shortly after witnessing the destruction of nearby positions. Army Group B, which had begun the battle with approximately 430,000 troops, capitulated in just 18 days. Intelligence assessments credited the rapid collapse in part to the relentless, systematic demolition of hardened positions by super-heavy artillery, convincing defenders that continued resistance had become pointless. Watervliet Arsenal and the machinery of victory. Behind every gun on the battlefield stood an industrial engine of extraordinary scale. Watervliet Arsenal, founded in 1813, had evolved by World War II into America's foremost producer of large-caliber artillery. Production records illustrate the escalation. 6 pilot howitzers were completed in late 1942. In 1943, output rose to 72 units, averaging 6 per month. The following year saw 158 guns produced, more than doubling the monthly rate. Between January and August 1945, another 79 howitzers rolled off the line. Total production reached 315 units. The arsenal's workforce peaked at 9,100 employees, operating around the clock in 3 continuous shifts. Women made up 35% of the labor force, performing high-precision machining tasks once assumed to be beyond their capabilities. Monthly payrolls exceeded $3 million, making the arsenal the largest employer in the capital district. Each gun barrel demanded staggering effort: 65 tons of specialized steel, hundreds of machining steps, days of precision boring, heat treatment at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, and final proof firing under overpressure conditions. Quality control standards were so strict that only 2 guns failed initial acceptance, and both issues were minor and quickly corrected. Not a single M1 240mm Howitzer ever suffered catastrophic failure in combat. To German analysts, American production of both guns and ammunition appeared almost incomprehensible. In reality, it was the culmination of industrial organization, engineering discipline, and logistical mastery. One of the clearest demonstrations of how manufacturing power translated directly into battlefield dominance. By the final years of the Second World War, American industry had achieved a level of artillery production that no other nation could match. At Watervliet Arsenal alone, manufacturing lines were turning out roughly 2,240mm artillery rounds every month by 1944. When this output was combined with parallel work at Picatinny Arsenal and a network of civilian subcontractors, total production climbed rapidly. By the opening months of 1945, the United States was completing close to 10,000 of these massive shells every single month. Each completed round was the result of an extraordinarily refined industrial process. The shell body was forged from 1440 chrome molybdenum steel, a material chosen for its strength and resistance to deformation under extreme pressure. Precision machining brought every shell within tolerances measured in hundredths of an inch. Inside, technicians packed nearly 50 pounds of high-grade TNT, carefully sealed and balanced. Rotating bands, essential for accuracy and barrel life, were machined to exact specifications, then individually measured and inspected before acceptance. The end product was not simply ammunition, but a carefully engineered instrument of war produced on an industrial scale. Equally impressive was the system that delivered this firepower to the front. Transatlantic supply routes carried these enormous rounds with remarkable reliability. Liberty ships routinely transported 240mm ammunition as deck cargo, with a single vessel capable of carrying as many as 500 shells. Once ashore, the Red Ball Express, America's high-speed logistics network in Europe, moved the ammunition forward. Specially reinforced trucks and dedicated ammunition units were assigned to handle the 360-pound projectiles, ensuring that even the heaviest artillery never went silent for lack of supply. The scale of consumption reflected this logistical strength. By April 1945, U.S. forces fighting in Europe had fired more than 118,000 rounds of 240mm ammunition, while still maintaining reserve stocks exceeding 100,000 rounds across the theater. Such sustained expenditure was unimaginable for any other belligerent power. This overwhelming availability amplified not only the physical destruction caused by the weapon, but also its psychological effect on the battlefield. Operating the 240mm Howitzer was itself a test of human coordination and stamina. A full gun crew consisted of 14 soldiers, each assigned a specific role without which the system could not function. A non-commissioned officer served as chief of section, directing the operation of the piece. The gunner laid the weapon on target, assisted by another crewman managing the breech. Several soldiers handled ammunition, while others operated the M2 crane used to lift the shells. Separate crew members managed the powder charges, and drivers provided transport and security for the unit. Bringing the weapon into action demanded flawless teamwork. The shell, weighing the equivalent of 2 fully grown men, was hoisted by crane and carefully guided by multiple crewmen into the open breach. Hydraulic rammers then seated it in place. Behind the projectile, crews loaded up to 8 individual bags of propellant, depending on the desired range. When executed by a well-trained team, the entire loading cycle could be completed in roughly a minute and a half. Veterans later recalled the physical punishment such work inflicted. Private First Class Michael Sullivan of the 697th Field Artillery Battalion, who served as an ammunition handler, described how exhaustion set in quickly. After only a handful of rounds, the crew's strength was visibly drained. Each firing felt like a blow to the chest as the shockwave rolled over the gun position. To keep the pace, men rotated duties throughout the day. What sustained them, Sullivan recalled, was the knowledge of what those shells did to reinforced German defenses. While gun crews endured the strain at the firing positions, forward observers faced danger of a different kind. These soldiers worked alongside frontline infantry, often operating under enemy fire and sometimes positioned ahead of friendly lines. Their task was to locate targets and adjust artillery fire with pinpoint accuracy. Lieutenant Robert Anderson of the 265th Field Artillery Battalion survived more than 6 months in continuous combat, during which he directed fire missions that destroyed dozens of fortified German bunkers. Reflecting years later, he compared calling in a 240mm strike to invoking a mythic force of nature, devastating, decisive, and impossible to ignore. He also acknowledged the sobering reality that every successful adjustment meant heavy enemy casualties. Observers carried specialized equipment to perform their role: high-magnification optical scopes, plotting boards for calculating fire data, SCR-610 radios with heavy backpack units, detailed maps and aerial photographs, compasses, and rangefinders. This gear allowed them to translate what they saw on the battlefield into precise coordinates for the guns miles away. The emotional toll of this work was severe. Through their optics, observers witnessed enemy soldiers fleeing collapsing bunkers, the wounded left behind, and the aftermath of each strike. Many carried these images with them long after the war ended, reporting vivid memories and recurring nightmares decades later. German records and post-war testimony confirmed the impact of this super-heavy artillery. Wehrmacht units, even those hardened by years of combat against Soviet massed artillery, were unprepared for the combination of American accuracy and destructive power. A captured report from the German 7th Army in late 1944 described the experience as a fundamentally new kind of warfare, one in which individual fortifications were singled out and annihilated by carefully observed, extraordinarily precise fire. Casualties resulting from individual artillery shells often surpassed those caused by traditional barrages, creating a devastating effect on morale. Soldiers frequently refused to occupy forward bunkers once these positions became targets. During the defense of the Vosges, the German 19th Army reported that approximately 60% of its losses were attributable to artillery fire, with the 240mm Howitzer inflicting particularly severe damage despite the relatively small number of shells fired. Bunkers that had provided protection for months turned into lethal traps once American observers identified and targeted them. In post-war interviews, German veterans repeatedly emphasized the profound psychological toll. Oberst Heinrich Simon, who commanded a regiment along the Siegfried Line, recounted in 1962, "We could tolerate conventional artillery, but these enormous shells shattered our morale. When a bunker vanished before our eyes, it became clear that no location was secure. Many of my men preferred to take their own lives rather than await the next impact." The M1 240mm Howitzer was a key component of the Allied super-heavy artillery arsenal, which also included British and Soviet weapons, yet it was American industrial production that gave the Allies a decisive edge. Production figures highlight this disparity. The United States manufactured 315 M1 Howitzers, Britain produced 36 BL 7.2-inch guns. The Soviet Union fielded 47 280mm BR-5 mortars, and Germany managed just 8 24cm K3 railway guns. The American advantage extended beyond sheer numbers. Mobility and operational endurance were crucial. While German and Soviet super-heavy artillery depended on railways or extensive site preparation, the M1 could be towed by tracked vehicles and deployed wherever terrain permitted, allowing greater flexibility in combat. British officers frequently recognized the effectiveness of American super-heavy artillery. Major General Sidney Kirkman, commanding artillery for the 13th Corps, noted, "The 240mm American Howitzer accomplished what our heavy guns could not. It enabled the rapid and systematic demolition of fortified positions. At Cassino, these weapons were instrumental in achieving the breakthrough." As Allied forces penetrated into Germany in early 1945, the 240mm Howitzer continued to play a pivotal role. Every city labeled a fortress by Hitler faced systematic bombardment by super-heavy artillery. The siege of Aschaffenburg from March 25 to April 3, 1945, demonstrated the weapon's precision in urban combat. The 36th Infantry Division had fortified the city with barricades and strongpoints in buildings. The 265th Field Artillery Battalion deployed 4 howitzers across the main river, systematically dismantling defensive positions. Remarkably, forward observers could direct 240mm rounds into specific buildings while sparing surrounding structures. This pinpoint capability often persuaded German commanders to surrender rather than witness the wholesale destruction of their cities. During the capture of Nuremberg from April 16 to April 20, 1945, 3 battalions of 240mm howitzers participated in the operation. Medieval fortifications, reinforced with modern concrete, succumbed rapidly under bombardment. The 698th Field Artillery Battalion destroyed 8 major bunkers within the city walls in just 4 hours on April 19. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, American 240mm howitzers had contributed decisively to the Allied victory. Official U.S. Army Ordnance statistics underscore this impact. A total of 118,429 rounds were fired in the European theater of operations. Of 3,847 bunkers and fortifications engaged, 3,114 were completely destroyed, 81%, while 489 were rendered unusable, 13%. On average, 38 rounds were required to neutralize a target. Maximum combat range reached 25,225 yards, with 23 gun tube replacements necessary and no catastrophic failures reported. The human toll, both physical and psychological, was immense. German records, although incomplete, estimate 15,000 to 20,000 casualties directly caused by 240mm bombardments, with psychological effects potentially doubling that number. Operational experience drove ongoing improvements in howitzer deployment. Initially, an 8-hour emplacement process limited tactical responsiveness, but by 1945, experienced crews had reduced setup time to under 4 hours through enhanced procedures and equipment. The introduction of mechanical fuse setters increased the rate of fire from 1 round every 3 minutes to 1 every 2 minutes during sustained operations, amplifying the weapon's destructive efficiency. Advances in propellant chemistry during the later years of the war dramatically improved the operational durability of American super-heavy artillery. Earlier barrels required replacement after roughly 500 firings, but refined powder formulations extended service life to nearly 800 rounds, reducing maintenance interruptions and increasing sustained fire capability during prolonged operations. Yet metallurgy and ballistics were only part of the transformation. The most consequential breakthrough was procedural rather than mechanical. The systematic fusion of aerial photo reconnaissance with artillery fire planning. By the final year of the war, forward observation teams no longer relied solely on verbal coordinates or rough maps. Instead, they were issued detailed aerial photographs meticulously annotated with numbered targets and grid references. Every bunker, gun position, and structural anomaly was cataloged in advance. This integration slashed the time needed to process fire missions from approximately 10 minutes to less than 4, allowing devastating accuracy under rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Although most documented use of the 240mm Howitzer occurred in the European theater, the weapon was not absent from the Pacific War. A small contingent of 6 guns was deployed during the Philippines campaign. In February 1945, these massive howitzers were brought to bear against Japanese defensive positions on Corregidor. Their performance exceeded expectations, particularly against reinforced concrete and subterranean defenses. Specialized armor-piercing shells proved decisive in this environment. Rather than merely collapsing surface structures, these rounds penetrated cave systems and sealed tunnel entrances, generating intense shock waves that caused lethal concussive effects deep within mountainsides. Japanese troops sheltered far from the point of impact were often incapacitated without ever seeing the explosion itself. American planners anticipated an even larger role for the 240mm Howitzer in the final phase of the war. During preparations for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, the U.S. Army projected a need for at least 100 of these weapons to dismantle extensive homeland fortifications. Japan's surrender rendered those plans moot. However, post-war interrogations revealed a striking admission from captured Japanese officers. Their defensive doctrines had never considered the possibility that the Americans could deploy mobile artillery of such overwhelming destructive precision. In the years that followed, military historians increasingly described the 240mm Howitzer as a turning point in the evolution of siege warfare. It challenged long-held assumptions about fortifications, demonstrating that no bunker, regardless of thickness or depth, could be considered secure. The unprecedented combination of mobility, pinpoint accuracy, and sheer destructive force effectively nullified traditional static defenses. The U.S. Army's official historical assessments echoed this conclusion. They noted that ground forces had, for the first time, gained access to a level of firepower previously associated only with naval bombardment or strategic air attacks. The howitzer could eliminate hardened targets with extraordinary precision, reshaping not only the physical battlefield, but also the psychological landscape of war. This impression was shared by foreign observers. Soviet officers granted access to destroyed German fortifications studied the results closely. Marshal Vasily Chukov, renowned for his command during the Battle of Stalingrad, personally inspected obliterated sections of the Siegfried Line. His assessment was blunt and revealing. The Americans, he remarked, had solved the problem of modern fortifications not through overwhelming numbers, but through accuracy, achieving with a single gun what dozens of conventional artillery pieces could not. The psychological impact of 240mm bombardment proved as significant as its physical effects. German veterans organizations later documented widespread trauma among survivors of bunker assaults. Fear of vibrations affected nearly 3/4 of those who endured bombardment. Claustrophobia was reported by more than 2/3, while an overwhelming majority developed an intense fear of loud sounds. These were not abstract statistics, but lived consequences of exposure to unprecedented firepower. In post-war Munich, psychiatrist Dr. Hans Müller treated numerous former soldiers suffering from what he termed bunker syndrome. His patients experienced recurring nightmares, sudden panic episodes, and an inability to enter concrete structures without distress. Müller theorized that the complete annihilation of positions believed to be invulnerable produced a distinct form of trauma rooted in the collapse of perceived safety rather than prolonged combat stress. American servicemen were not immune to psychological aftereffects. Forward observers frequently described persistent dreams in which they relived the act of calling in fire missions. Gun crews reported long-term hearing damage despite the use of protective gear. Even decades later, veterans spoke vividly of the physical sensations, the tremor of the earth beneath their feet, the pressure against the chest, and the thunderous blast that seemed to pass through the body itself. Ultimately, the effective use of the 240mm Howitzer reflected a broader American approach to warfare, industrial scale married to technical precision. It was not merely a weapon, but a statement of doctrine that mass production could coexist with accuracy, and that engineering, when aligned with intelligence and planning, could decisively reshape the nature of modern combat. During World War II, Germany focused on creating extraordinary singular weapons, such as the Carl Gustav 600mm mortar and the Schwerer Gustav 800mm railway gun. These marvels represented engineering feats, yet their operational use was highly constrained. For instance, the 600mm mortar required an entire day to prepare a single firing, and its rate of fire was only 1 round every 10 minutes. By contrast, the United States emphasized mass-produced artillery systems designed for rapid deployment and sustained firing. The American 240mm M1 Howitzer could be ready in just 4 hours and maintained a firing rate of 1 round every 2 minutes. This contrast illustrates two divergent philosophies. Germany pursued technological marvels capable of providing a decisive battlefield edge, while America leveraged the strength of quantity, reliability, and efficiency. The 240mm Howitzer program, encompassing research, production, and ammunition, totaled roughly $120 million by 1945, an equivalent to producing 40 B-24 bombers or 1,600 Sherman tanks. Despite the high cost, the strategic benefits of quickly neutralizing heavily fortified positions made the investment worthwhile. The impact of the M1 extended far beyond the war, demonstrating the practical value of super-heavy mobile artillery and influencing post-war weapons development during the Cold War. The Soviet Union's 2S4 Tulpan II 240mm self-propelled mortar drew inspiration from American wartime experience. Techniques in fire control, including the FDC system and coordinated aerial reconnaissance, established standards that would guide artillery operations for decades. Even contemporary GPS-guided munitions can trace their conceptual origins to the precise targeting practices of 1944 to 1945. As American artillery pounded German positions, the ruins of fortified defensive lines told a larger story. Beneath the collapsed bunkers and shattered barriers lay the collapse of a long-held belief that concrete, steel, and careful planning could indefinitely resist attack. The devastation left behind was not only physical, it marked the failure of a military doctrine that had placed its faith in immovable defenses. The sound of the 240mm guns carried a message that went beyond the battlefield. Their rolling thunder announced the arrival of an industrial power operating at full capacity, one that had aligned mass production with scientific precision. To the soldiers on the receiving end, the meaning was unmistakable. They were no longer fighting an opponent limited by scarcity or hesitation. They were facing a nation capable of sustaining overwhelming force until resistance became pointless. Long after the guns fell silent, the psychological effects endured. Many veterans struggled for years to comprehend what they had witnessed. Fortifications once described as invulnerable erased within hours, defensive positions reduced to debris by relentless bombardment. These experiences forced a reckoning. Military thinkers on all sides were compelled to accept a new reality. Static defenses had become obsolete in the age of modern industrial warfare. The 240mm Howitzer spoke with authority not because of its size alone, but because of the system behind it. It demonstrated that no bunker was beyond reach, no fixed position immune to destruction. Walls meant to protect could just as easily become graves. This realization reshaped how war would be planned and fought in the decades that followed. For German forces, the encounter with American heavy artillery was not simply terrifying, it was transformative. Many who had entered the conflict convinced of their technological and organizational superiority finished it with a different understanding. They had been outmatched by a society capable of converting raw resources into sophisticated weapons at a pace no authoritarian system could rival. In the end, the most decisive achievement of the 240mm Howitzer was not the fortresses it erased from the landscape, but the certainty it erased from the minds of those who faced it. Its thunder was more than noise. It was a declaration that in the modern era, industrial strength and adaptability could overwhelm even the most ambitious defenses. In that sense, it became a defining voice of democratic industry answering the challenge of tyranny. The logistical demands of operating 240mm howitzers were enormous. Each battalion required 67 vehicles encompassing specialized prime movers, cranes, and ammunition transporters. Fuel consumption during movement averaged around 2,000 gallons per day. The immense weight of the artillery frequently caused damage to roads, necessitating ongoing support from engineering units to sustain supply lines. The M1 240mm Howitzer epitomized the American approach to warfare, delivering overwhelming firepower with precision sustained by virtually limitless industrial production. While individual German fortifications could be robust, American industry could systematically destroy them faster than Germany could reconstruct them. This inevitability of victory, derived from industrial capacity, intimidated German commanders far more than tactical setbacks. Clever strategies could partially compensate for numerical inferiority, and skillful leadership could occasionally offset operational disadvantages, but no tactical maneuver could counteract unlimited, accurately delivered artillery fire supported by endless ammunition. The 240mm Howitzer symbolized the industrial and democratic foundations of American military strength. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Watertown, staffed by free laborers, produced weapons capable of demolishing fortifications built by forced labor under totalitarian regimes. The triumph of these weapons was therefore not only a military achievement, but also a moral statement. Democratic societies were capable of mobilizing resources and manpower to a scale that dictatorships could not match. The German experience with American 240mm artillery was more than a battlefield defeat. It induced a profound psychological transformation. Soldiers who had previously placed faith in German engineering, the supposed impregnability of concrete bunkers, and the tactical advantages of prepared defenses, came to understand that American industrial and logistical capabilities had rendered their doctrines obsolete. Statistical records alone cannot fully capture this impact. 315 howitzers were deployed, 118,429 rounds fired, and 3,114 bunkers destroyed. Yet the deeper consequence lay in the erosion of German confidence in static defenses. Each bunker reduced to rubble served as tangible evidence of American superiority, not only in artillery, but across the full spectrum of warfare, including production, organization, logistics, and technological innovation. The psychological effect on German commanders and soldiers was decisive. The certainty of industrially backed American firepower fundamentally undermined the very principles of their military planning and defensive strategy. The American 240mm Howitzer was not merely a weapon designed to break concrete and steel. Its real impact reached far deeper, striking at the confidence and assumptions that underpinned German defensive strategy. When these massive guns entered combat, Wehrmacht troops quickly realized that the danger was not limited to the explosion itself. What frightened them was what the weapons symbolized: a system capable of producing vast quantities of ammunition, coordinating fire with extraordinary accuracy, maintaining mechanical dependability under extreme conditions, and sustaining destruction on a scale made possible only by the industrial capacity of the United States. As American artillery pounded German positions, the ruins of fortified defensive lines told a larger story. Beneath the collapsed bunkers and shattered barriers lay the collapse of a long-held belief that concrete, steel, and careful planning could indefinitely resist attack. The devastation left behind was not only physical, it marked the failure of a military doctrine that had placed its faith in immovable defenses. The sound of the 240mm guns carried a message that went beyond the battlefield. Their rolling thunder announced the arrival of an industrial power operating at full capacity, one that had aligned mass production with scientific precision. To the soldiers on the receiving end, the meaning was unmistakable. They were no longer fighting an opponent limited by scarcity or hesitation. They were facing a nation capable of sustaining overwhelming force until resistance became pointless. Long after the guns fell silent, the psychological effects endured. Many veterans struggled for years to comprehend what they had witnessed. Fortifications, once described as invulnerable, erased within hours. Defensive positions reduced to debris by relentless bombardment. These experiences forced a reckoning. Military thinkers on all sides were compelled to accept a new reality. Static defenses had become obsolete in the age of modern industrial warfare. The 240mm Howitzer spoke with authority not because of its size alone, but because of the system behind it. It demonstrated that no bunker was beyond reach, no fixed position immune to destruction. Walls meant to protect could just as easily become graves. This realization reshaped how war would be planned and fought in the decades that followed. For German forces, the encounter with American heavy artillery was not simply terrifying, it was transformative. Many who had entered the conflict convinced of their technological and organizational superiority finished it with a different understanding. They had been outmatched by a society capable of converting raw resources into sophisticated weapons at a pace no authoritarian system could rival. In the end, the most decisive achievement of the 240mm Howitzer was not the fortresses it erased from the landscape, but the certainty it erased from the minds of those who faced it. Its thunder was more than noise. It was a declaration that in the modern era, industrial strength and adaptability could overwhelm even the most ambitious defenses. In that sense, it became a defining voice of democratic industry, answering the challenge of tyranny.